Hello everybody and welcome to week 1 of English as a Medium of Instruction for Academics. This is the video which we're recording on the Friday afternoon and should be available to you tomorrow as soon as possible anyway. I'm Mary, this is Rob, and we're just so delighted that you've joined our MOOC, and we're here today just to make a few comments on the way to use our MOOC as effectively as possible, and just mention some of the good things that already we're noticing. What have you noticed already, Rob?
I've noticed, a number of things. In terms of content,
Yeah.
I think my quote of the week, Michael Muller, it says, so essentially what we're dealing with here is a process rather than a one-time achievement. And I think
Like that.
Lots of people have said, what they're dealing with here is really in the principles of education that we should have anyway. So once you think you've achieved victory and then you teach the next cohort of students in exactly the same way, it fails because you're overconfident, you're assuming the new students are the same as the last ones. So there are difficulties that come with EMI, but I think emphasising the idea that this is ongoing, a constant reflective learning process is very important.
My quote of the week,
back to you. Go on, yes.
My quote of the week is from Barbara, who I think might be in Brazil, I'm not sure. EMI brings a new spark to the table, which I think is a lovely image. So I hope that, through the discussions and the texts and the things that are happening on this MOOC, that you will find a new spark, and that spark will bring a new dimension to your teaching if you're already teaching, or a spark that sort of enables you, I'm trying to continue with the metaphor, ignites your enthusiasm for teaching in the wider context, but for EMI in particular.
And I'd say, actually, I do find when I teach, after looking at the comments on the MOOC and dealing with these issues, what people bring to the discussion is very interesting, and I find that my teaching improves just thinking about these elements. And then I go into a lecture hall and think of all the possibilities for how people are interpreting what I'm doing. And it's really interesting to get involved.
I think it just increases the notion that EMI is so fluid and so different. There's not one model, one standard. And we constantly invent it for our context and then reinvent it for our context. And that's what's good, isn't it? I mean, it would be very boring if it were constantly the same. Anyway, some lovely things that have happened during the week. Barbara, I think it's the same Barbara that I mentioned earlier, is really engaging tremendously well and frequently with Alicia, and thank you, Alicia. Alicia is an old friend from the very first run of the MOOC, who is now back with us, participating in this run and being a wonderful asset to the course. There's Ludmilla, there's Theodora, Carmen, Yoshikatsu, Kifong, Aura. So many people are beginning to really engage, and this is the joy of the experience. It's that international engagement and exchange of ideas, to know that somebody in a country far, far away is actually experiencing something either that's very similar to what you're experiencing, or you can actually help them through your experience. And I don't know whether it's just me, but I get such a thrill from this global engagement.
And maybe now is a good time to mention that we do encourage you. So you started to comment, and it's wonderful to see different people's comments. It's really good if you can engage with each other. So the function of liking, even, so letting people know that you're reading what their comments are, and also replying. So you're building on each other's ideas and co-constructing knowledge in this area. And there are not many functions to the comment board, but these simple things are very, very effective in terms of letting people know that you're listening and being involved in a discussion. Although your ideas are very interesting individually as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is part of the way that you should think of Robin and me, that obviously we develop the course and we facilitate the course. So don't be waiting for likes necessarily from us or comments from us. It's the other people on the course who are just as valuable, in fact even more valuable, more important.
Much more valuable.
Much more valuable in the discussions, because you've got the experiences that we don't have. You know, we're from a very samey situation in Southampton, and we can only imagine some of the situations that you're in. So the value comes from reading, liking, discussing, you know, putting in a comment from time to time. And we have to remind people as well to go back, because we've got people joining the course like every day, and they will continue to join the course right up until the end. So that means that they'll be putting in their comments after you have commented. You've kind of got to get into the habit of going back to the beginning again and just seeing what comments have been added and so on. And then you actually gain more.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so I could add another... some areas of discussion that have been very interesting. We'll just go through very quickly.
Yeah, we'll just do we've got a list each of the things we want to say.
I thought one interesting area is the idea that comes up quite regularly of the differences between speaking and writing. And I think this is quite interesting because writing tends to be more sort of a gatekeeper function. We have this idea that writing, so being flexible in the speaking that you tolerate in class is different from being flexible about the writing that you tolerate. And Amy asked for examples of the way that writing is changing, and I think the field of composition and discourse analysis is documenting how writing constantly changes in terms of conventions. But I'd also say it's not necessarily an assumption that in an educational environment you always have to demand a particular standard of writing, and that students will develop their writing ability by you treating them very strictly in terms of the writing you expect. I think developing literacy happens, especially in the modern age. You know, we develop digital literacies. Students will be expected to communicate in different ways at university and in their future careers. So I wouldn't necessarily go with this sort of binary idea, writing has to be accurate and I have to absolutely insist on accurate writing all the time. Lots of the materials I use with my students encourage them to simply communicate in writing, and that's a foundation for future development in terms of their literacy and their writing. So I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, but you are right that gatekeeping around writing is very much stronger than gatekeeping around speaking in terms of language accuracy and things like that. And writing actually dominates a lot of how we learn to speak. So it's a big area, but I think we can look at ideas of how we can deal with writing beyond this binary.
I agree, Rob, and you've touched on the fact that although this MOOC is about EMI, it kind of spills out and over into other areas that you are involved in. People, I think it was an exchange between, I've got noted here, Antonio and Maurizio, talking more about living and working and studying and using English. So many of the things that we touch upon in the course are not just EMI issues, but they have wider implications for your work and for your careers. Perhaps conferences you might go to, okay, there's a lot of similarity with the EMI classroom. If you think about having to present in English at a conference. So although it is EMI that we're focusing on, the implications and the effects of what we're talking about on this course are really quite wide, and you will be able to apply the things that we talk about and the ideas in your different contexts. And just for teaching in general, there was a lovely exchange between Barbara, Abdullah and Amar about all the different issues that we talk about in this first week of the MOOC. and about the use of the English language and the sort of standards of English that people might be worried about, concerned about, both you and your students. And it was Barbara that talked about actually establishing a kind of contract about the use of English or the mother tongue in the classroom, so that it's clear to everybody how you, in your environment, in your classroom, you and your students are going to communicate with one another so that everybody's comfortable. There's no right or wrong way, it's just what works for you, but it has to be verbalised. And so the idea of a contract, is useful in many teaching situations, but I think it's particularly interesting here, don't you? It's important to make that clear, so we know where we are with the language and how to behave when things happen.
Yeah, and I could quickly summarise like most of the points I found most interesting this week in terms of diversity. So we've got diversity of what EMI means in particular contexts. We've got different reasons why people focus on different uses of language and reactions to, say, flexibility in language or non-flexibility in language. We have different roles. So again, like Amy mentioned having been employed because of her ability to speak English and her status as an English speaker, versus her awareness that lots of that is related to identity and it's not necessarily the best way to insist on communication occurring in the classroom. So there is a lot of diversity among our group, and again, I think we can learn from each other. So very interesting themes to follow in future weeks.
Absolutely, and it did come up, and I can't remember who it was that actually wrote this, but the fact that we native speakers actually have more to learn from the non-native English speakers in this particular context. So everybody has knowledge and expertise, and we all learn from one another. And there was Amar, who comes from a slightly different background in the sense that he makes comparisons with French as a medium of instruction. So I would encourage you, Amar, to just perhaps let us know something of the differences that you have encountered when using French as a medium of instruction. I think that would be very interesting, and we could learn from your experience. I've just got one more person to mention, and that is Ludmilla, if I haven't mentioned Ludmilla already. And I'm going to highlight and pin her contribution because she starts a discussion about native speakerism, which is really fundamental to what we've just been saying and to the whole notion of EMI in particular. So I won't summarise what she said, but say go back to Ludmilla's contribution and to the comments that follow already, follow on from her comments, and there's a lot for us to discuss there. Is there anything else you'd like to say?
Just add that when we look at native speakerism, we're not always only looking at native speakers. Native speakerism and ideologies associated with it are often perpetuated by a wide range of people, including students, including administrational staff. So again, it's a very wide discussion, not limited to the native speaker only.
No, not at all.
That's,
so Ludmilla has really started off a good discussion there that we can all investigate and learn from.
Absolutely. Yes, and the only thing I was going to mention is just the change of English. Does it change the content? Most people agree that it shouldn't really change the content, but change the delivery.
Okay.
And again,
just one practical issue. Annie asked about accessing an article, which I didn't have any difficulty accessing. So I don't know whether you, Annie, were actually just not able to access the article, or whether you wanted a PDF version of the article. I didn't quite understand. Could you let me know, and we'll resolve that for you. So any little things like that, if there is perhaps a link to an article and it doesn't come up, we need to know those details so that we can make it better for everybody. All right. So from a very chilly Southampton, I think we ought to say bye-bye.
Yes.
Hope for better weather where you are, and certainly better weather for us next
It's
week.
more than likely, yeah.
Okay,
thank you very much for
Thank
watching
you.
and
Thank
for
you.
taking part. It's really good.
Yes. All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.